Today we're going to be looking at what happened on Palm Sunday. And if you're new around here and don't know much about, the story, Palm Sunday, is the day when the palms were kind of raised before Jesus as he made his entry into Jerusalem. And we're going to see that. And we're going to focus particularly on John's gospel, John's telling of these events. It's going to be in chapter 12. Certainly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the other gospel writers, have comments on this, and we'll just draw on a couple of those. But mostly we're going to be focusing on John's retelling of the events of this day. So we're going to begin in chapter 12 of John, and let's take a look at that passage as we put it up here. It's the beginning, verses 1 and 2. It begins like this. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. So, if you were reading in John, in chapter 11, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. He's been in a grave, or more properly in a tomb. He'd been in a tomb for 4 days, and Jesus is now with him and his two sisters, who are Martha and Mary. And the site of the party is Bethany, which is about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. And this is where Jesus is going to meet his destiny on Holy Week. He goes there actually to precipitate the crisis that will lead to his death. Now, Luke had recorded in his gospel account Jesus' view on going to Jerusalem. And it's found in Luke 9, and it goes like this. As the time approached for Jesus to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Now, let me just stop and say something here. This is one of the things I love about Jesus as you read about him in the Gospels. Despite any appearances to the contrary, nothing ever happens to him. He's always in control of the events of his life. Even when things, and especially when things look out of control, he's not driven by circumstances. He is driving them for his purposes because, of course, he's God in the flesh. Now, let's think about this dinner. It's at the home of a man named Simon the leper. Now, I don't know, if you find this in the Bible, but there's some names that get a little confusing. Guess how many Simons there are in the New Testament? There's 9 Simons. We know probably Simon Peter. You could have named that Simon the Zealot. There's Simon the leper. Let me read this Matthew's parallel account that kind of identifies this situation. It's in Matthew 26. While Jesus was in Bethany, and here's the detail, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. That's what we're going to be seeing in John. Now, there's a whole lot of gratitude at this dinner party because Simon, the ex-leper, as I'm calling him, is there with his two sisters, Martha and Mary, and it's hosted by Lazarus, the ex-dead guy. Okay? So Lazarus had spent 4 days dead, and now an ex-leper is hosting a party for an ex-dead guy. I mean, it must have been interesting to be around Jesus in those days because you couldn't stay dead or sick around him that well. I mean, he was amazing, right? But the thing is, this story isn't about them. It's just creating the setting, but it can get lost. It's like an ex-leper and an ex-dead guy are at this dinner, but it's not about them. It's actually about someone else. There's one person who makes the events of this moment not about gratitude for healing or being raised from the dead, but the story is, not surprisingly when you're looking at Jesus, about love. It's about adoration. And if I may say this very gently, if you don't love Jesus, you don't know him yet. Because to know him is to love him. That's okay. You can get to know him, and I hope you do. I say this from personal experience. I deeply love Jesus. I owe him everything. Any success in my life is due to him. He sees my failures and loves me anyway. I am nothing without Jesus. My mission in life is to help people see and know the love of Jesus. Then Mary, it says in John 12:3, then Mary took about a pint, which is about a half a liter. So think about a 2-liter soda bottle and, take that in quarters. So, about a half liter of pure nard, an expensive perfume. Now, other accounts in the other Gospels tell of the nard being poured all over the body of Jesus. But John's account focuses on the feet because what happens is, of course, it pools at his feet and she uses her hair to wipe it off. And so that's what he's focusing on. But there's one thing I really want you to see here, and that is the extravagance of Mary's love for Jesus. the extravagance of her love for him. What she uses is expensive. It was, you'd get it in the Himalayas. You would purify these plants that apparently were a lot like honeysuckle. And so it was hard to get and it was expensive. Judas will later say in our passage that the amount that she used would cost a year's wages. That's expensive. And the other thing I want you to see is she breaks all the conventions of her day in the way she wipes his feet with her hair. But Mary has poured this half liter of nard on Jesus, and when she sees it pooling at his feet, she lets down her hair to wipe off the excess. Now, I'm describing it, but try to feel the moment. The men reclining at the table, as they do, on an elbow, and this woman pouring this on his body, on his feet, and then letting her hair down, and because there's excess, wiping it with her hair. Do you feel the intimacy? I mean, I don't know what word you'd think of, but it's quite a moment. To her, Jesus is so wonderful that all the day's conventions are discarded if they get in the way of her loving him. It's like, I don't care who's looking. I don't care what anybody's saying. I want to love Jesus. Now, why did she love him so much? There's only one reason why anybody loves Jesus like this. Because she had felt his love for her. John writes in one of his epistles, we love because he first loved us. Don't let that be theology. That's just heart stuff. We love because we go, he's loved me. And that's why we return the love. She'd felt his love for her. And I'm going to tell a story, it's just from the previous chapter, about when Jesus came through, when her brother had died. And of course, as we said, he raised her from the dead. But what I want you to watch for here is not the facts of the story, but the emotions of the story as you watch Jesus' emotional reaction to Mary's loss. I'm reading now from John 11. So there was this thing with Martha and Mary, and I'm going to jump in at verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, let me try to say this with the feeling she might have had. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. If you'd only been here. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit, and he was troubled. Where have you laid him? Well, come and see, Lord. And Jesus begins weeping. The Son of God begins weeping. And you know what the Jews say? See how he loved him. That's what strikes them. There's only one thing that will cause you to fall in love with Jesus. When you experience his love, it changes you. Mary had that. And when you see how the Son of God responds to a woman over the grief of the loss of her brother, he weeps, and the onlookers go, oh, he did love him. And that, by the way, friends, is what this meeting's about today. We are here because we are people who've experienced the love of Jesus. Maybe not everybody. You may be an onlooker, which is fine. We're glad you're here. But we sing because we've experienced the love of Jesus, and we say, praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, 3 in 1, because we've been loved by him. Now, I know all of you. I know you have a place inside of you that's hurt and broken. And when you bring that need and hurt before Jesus, and he says to you, and you feel him say, it's okay, I know. I love you. I was actually there. I want to heal you, but I'm going to walk through this with you. It makes you love him. Or when you have something in your past you're ashamed of, and you go, oh, God, if I ever was honest with you about some of the things I did in my life, there's no way you could love me. And then you get the guts to kind of open that up to him, and he goes, no, I do love you. That's put aside. I love you so much. That love changes us, and that's what changed Mary. And I'm going to tell you what we learned from this moment with Mary. Ready for it? Friend, you can never be too extravagant in your love for Jesus. You hear me? You can never, ever be too extravagant in your love for Jesus. But what makes Mary's love stand out even more is the contrast that John paints. This is the obvious point of the passage, the context of where they are. It's the contrast between Mary's love and Judas's greed and lack of love, okay? And that's where we're going to go next. Look at how Judas reacts to what Mary does. We're now in verse 4. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Now, what does Judas think they should have done, or she should have done? She should have sold it and given it to the poor. And he was a guy who was a thief, so he couldn't quite get it out to say, "Why don't you give it to us so I can skim off some of it?" But underneath what he says is his core belief, and it's shocking when you see it for what it is. Do you know what Judas believes, but he can't quite get himself to say, at least not out loud? You know what he's really thinking? Jesus isn't worth it. That's what he's thinking. Jesus isn't worth something that costs a year's wages. It's exactly what he's saying. Well, at least we know what you think, Judas. I spoke about virtue signaling last week. It's when you express your opinions publicly to demonstrate your good character. And that's exactly what Judas is doing here. He's inwardly filled with shame, and so because of that shame, he has to put stuff on the outside and the veneer to make himself look good, right? It's kind of like he's wearing this t-shirt, Let's give to the poor. That's the t-shirt he's wearing. Meanwhile, he's really thinking, let's give to the treasury so I can skim some. You can take that down. This is something that authentic Christ followers don't have to do. Judas felt shame on the inside, so he had to put on a fake veneer of righteousness, right? Christians can say, I don't feel any shame anymore, so I don't have to make you think I'm so good. You hear me? That's what was going on in him. He's feeling so guilty. He goes, so I got to pretend on the outside. And that's what people do today, don't they? They feel bad about what they're really doing, and so they do this virtue signaling where Christians say, no, actually, I'm pretty bad on the inside, and Jesus has forgiven me, so I don't have to show you how good I am. That's settled. Now, when people have to tell you how great they are, they're most likely trying to cover some insecurity, right? Inner insecurity. And that's what Judas is doing. He's hiding the darkness within, and Jesus calls him out on it. Verse 7. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You're always going to have the poor among you. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Friends, if someone said this today, they'd get canceled faster than a bad postage stamp, right? He's saying, you're worried about giving to the poor. There's always going to be poor people around, but I'm here just for a little while, and it's better to spend a year's wages on me than giving it to poor people. I mean, let that sit with you for a second. Isn't it outrageous? Who says that kind of thing? Who says that kind of thing and doesn't come across as a megalomaniac? Don't give the poor, worship me. No one ever, except Jesus. Because worshiping Jesus, he's saying, worshiping me is the first thing. Every other good thing a person does has a broken root if it's not tethered to worshiping him. Now, that's a nice theological statement. Let me tell you what it means. It's not just because he's worthy of worship, but he is, because he is. It's because when he comes first, everything else you do isn't for you, it's for him. And that cleans up your motives and allows you to do something that's not selfishly oriented in the process of serving others. You hear what I'm saying? I mean, a lot of people serve others for themselves. But when you're worshiping Jesus, you're saying, no, you come first. What can I do for you? It's not about me anymore. And all of a sudden, those things become radically purified. Now, it's an odd statement Jesus makes. He says, she's preparing me for burial. And again, he knows what's coming. He's in complete control. Let's go on to verse 9 through 11. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he'd raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. I mean, have you noticed that before? I didn't really notice it when I was studying that before. It's like, he was dead once and they're going to kill him again. This guy can't get a break. Wow. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, for on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. Now, I want to tell you something about the religious life. It can make you better, but it can also make you worse. Do you know that? You see that in Christians as well, who are, well, frankly, they're just worse. They're getting worse. And it made these chief priests worse. And that's because they had gotten their power by being religious, and they didn't want to lose it, so they They hadn't become good. They held on to their power so that they could appear superior to other people. Do you get that? So they used their religion to appear superior to people, and people still do that today. We use religion maybe to justify pride and hatred, and that's a terrible thing. That's what they were doing. It's like, I don't want to lose my power. Now, let's finish off the passage, and then I'll make a few last comments, and then we'll finish up. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches, and that's the Palm Sunday part, and went out to meet him shouting, Hosanna! God saves, as Matt said earlier. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, do not be afraid, daughter of Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt. At first, his disciples did not understand all this. Only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him and that these things had been done to him. So they get that perspective. Now, the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. And actually, what commentators say is there's a crowd coming down from Bethany, and then there's a crowd coming up from Jerusalem, and the two meet, and then they begin to follow Jesus. That's what's going on here. Many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him. Now, I want to close the message by talking about two types of people who missed Jesus. First were the religious people who missed him, and it was because they made their life about using religion to get power, and Jesus was a threat to their ability to use and maintain control, because they were all about control, which is the worst thing you can do with religion, right? You take your religion, you take your faith, and you try to control people with it. And that's why they missed him. But the crowd, a lot of the crowd missed him too, because what they really were looking for was a great show, and Jesus was putting on a phenomenal show. And this was a day before TV. I mean, this was a good show to watch. When I was 21, I missed Jesus. I tell this story from time to time, so bear with me if you've heard it before. I tell the story of how I was walking down a beach in Florida with an acquaintance of mine who had this new relationship with Jesus. And he was telling me about it. And you know how you have moments in your life you can snapshot? I can snapshot the first time I saw my wife. And I remember the moment I was walking with him, and I said, Tom, that's good for you. And of course, I meant it. Why didn't it hit? Because it wasn't my time. God hadn't opened my heart and said, this is your time. I wasn't looking. I wasn't searching. But then a year later, God must have prompted him to pick up the phone. He called me, how are you doing? That was the most consequential question anybody ever asked me in my life, because at that moment, I said to him, there's something missing from my life, and I don't know what it is. Well, you tell a Christian that, and they're like a dog on meat. It's like, I'm coming right over. And have you ever felt that way? That there's something missing in your life? Because if you have, or if you are, what that is it's God's Spirit. He's calling you. He calls us. He says, this is your time, Mark. Now you feel that need, and I'm here, and I'm going to meet that need. And once again, this room here is full of people who've heard that call and responded to it. And God's filled that void for us. So Palm Sunday, that's what today is. A bunch of people right there with Jesus. They're right there with him. And some of them just think they're welcoming a local miracle worker. Surely none of them grasped in fullness who he was. Others are so mad they want to kill him and the ex-dead guy. And I want to say, Jesus was there, but Jesus is here right now. He's actually here in this room. Because he said, and look at the passage from Matthew 18, again, truly I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three gather in my name, there I am with them. Now, I'm not great at mental math, but I think we met the quota. Two or three gathering in his name. And what did he promise? He is here. I want to ask you to read chapters 18 through 21 of John's Gospel. If you need, take a picture of that so you can remember, do it. Then, and it's pretty simple, come either Wednesday or Thursday night, 7 o'clock service, as we come to communion by way of the crosses, and Joel will be leading us in that. Come to those services. They are the most impactful services of the year. They always have been here. So come to one of those services and then come Easter Sunday. And while you are doing those things, while you're reading through those chapters, say this simple prayer: God, let me see your love for me this week. Get that? God, let me see your love for me this week. He loves to hear that prayer. Let's see what he'll do in all of our lives.